Now, we would like to start brainstorming for IR4, a society transformed by big data. What will become of its governance, economics, and lifestyles? Let us just introduce the members on the stage. The co-founders, think tank SophiaBank, Ms. Kumi Fujisawa. And Chairman, Institute for Urban Strategies, the Mori Memorial Foundation, President of Academyhills, Professor Heizo Takenaka. And founder and CEO of Institution for a Global Society, and professor at Keio University, Economics Department, Professor Masahiro Fukuhara. And the professor at Graduate School of Law, Keio University, Professor Tatsuhiko Yamamoto. So those are the speakers. Now I would like to hand the microphone over to Professor Takenaka to moderate the session. Good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us for this brainstorming. The Innovative City Forum was started in 2013, and this marks the 7th of its kind. But for the past few sessions, the brainstorm session has become one of the focal points, and the world is changing in a rapid manner, and we don't know what is going to happen. So we will rather, instead of having experts and guru sharing their thoughts, but everybody gets together to share the information and interaction. And in the Davos Forum, this type of session is quite popular, so we have been aware of that, and we've been holding these sessions for the past few years. And we have taken up the big data as Industrial Revolution 4.0 is ongoing, and there is a presence of platformers that is becoming prevalent. And there are positive aspects, but there are also negative or aspects that we have to be careful of. So we would like to take a look at this from various perspectives. And in this session, of course, the main actors are you as the audience, and you will be going into breakout sessions with excellent moderators and resource persons assigned to each breakout session. But we'd like to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about the triggers and food for thoughts for you to have discussions later on big data. So the person who is quite positive on big data, and also a person who believes that big data is useful, but there should be some caution. So there are two different school of thoughts represented here. Let's start with the person who's positive. So as was introduced, Professor Fukuhara here with us today. So in one word, big data and artificial intelligence using new technologies, you can improve education and personnel management, the human resources development. Fintech and human tech are now buzzwords, but from the perspective of a person who's actually engaged in those activities, Professor Fukuhara will be given about 10 minutes talking about this. So, Professor Fukuhara, over to you. Thank you for the introduction. I am Fukuhara. First of all, let me just ask you questions first. First, you will be probably having interviews with possible new hires at your companies. So do you think that you can actually judge people in hiring the people? A person of 5,000 employees, the presidents of those companies say that they have to bring about innovations. So new graduates and mid-career personnel, whether they were able to hire people who will bring about innovation. So big data will be used, and also the decision-making by the interviewers should be transformed into data, and we have used our services Grow 360 to make an analysis. What the president said is that right after they went to San Francisco, design thinking was important. So the empathy and also listening ability is important. So there are several factors that are related to innovation. But after the analysis, what was the result? So as you can see here, so they focused on academic background. This is the almost the main factor. And then the logical thinking. So who was hated most was the person with creativity. And also empathy and listening skills. They are also hated. So you are laughing at this, but looking back, when you do the personnel hiring interview, are you really able to discern people who have empathy and listening skills and creativity? Because there's uncertainty and ambiguity here, but the big data can make it more visible and visualize that. That is what the big data can do. So from a different perspective, just let me share with you the bias that people have. This month, there's Vienna Philharmony and Berlin Philharmony are here. And there used to be only 5% of female represented in orchestra in 1970s, but now 35% to 40% are represented by female players in orchestra. Why is that? There are more female players? No, there's no such evidence. So what has changed is only one thing. The way they hired was changed. So what did they do? So there's one black curtain placed right in front of the player. So whether they were able to evaluate the performance of the player, so the female were selected more. So the judges used to have the discrimination against women, obviously. But with the science and big data, you can see the tendency for discrimination. There's implicit association test. There's a black person's photo in the middle. So the black people on the right, so you can just classify this photo to black people. So it may sound very, very easy, but those of you who think that this is easy, then if you exchange the white people and black people, if the speed of classification is slowed down, then there is a tendency for discrimination. If you see white people in the subconscious level, you just have that information. If there's a black people and good are combined, then you may not be able to classify the person into black people so clearly. From 2002, there has been verification of that at Harvard University and others. So with the AI, you can identify this bias and the preconceived idea by the people.
So you must be involved in a lot of decision-making at the corporate level. You might have all the knowledge and experience. However, you might feel that your boss doesn't understand anything. However, they would still make the judgment. So have you ever been really not persuaded based on the decision of your boss? I have, because you wonder why the boss made those decisions. That may be the reason why I became the CEO of this institute. So when you consider this issue, the decision-making should be based on the experience and also should be done by people who are capable to do so. So if you were to do that, then the efficiency and the efficacy of the company would be enhanced. So actually, this particular hedge fund, Bridgewater, is the hedge fund which had evolved from a very small-scale investment company to one of the largest hedge funds. So let's just say out of 17 members, they're trying to make a decision, and 13 members agreed to it, yes, and 23% said no. So 13 to 4 in terms of the actual number. But perhaps within this 4%, 13 to 4% may have had people who were capable in making the decisions based on historical data. So if we have that data, then we give more weightage to those people. So this could be considered as believability or meritocracy. So although it was 4% only, which was only 23% no, because they give that additional weightage, now that percentage has gone up to 81%. So the person who developed IBM Watson, now the person works for Bridgewater. So through the big data and also the AI system, now the decision-making system is changing, and we are capable to do so. So in fact, some of the resource person and some of the facilitators, we've conducted some analysis based on this system. So, for instance, the Japanese government, should they actually introduce the privacy information regulation as a GDPR? So, in terms of democratic state, we have 60% of no, 40% yes. So it was quite close in terms of the vote. However, based on a very detailed analysis of the decision making that the individual persons have conducted in the past, actually, the percentage has dramatically changed. 91% was no. So this is a change after changing the decision-making system. So rather than just resorting to democratic system, by making use of big data, there is an opportunity to dramatically change the decision-making process. And indeed, it is one of the major opportunity in the big data era. So based on the quality and characteristic of the facilitators, I have tried to plot them in this 2D data. So if we want to conduct a discussion based on more of a sympathetic psychological discussion, then you would need people with more homogeneity in their characteristic. However, if you want to have more of a provocative discussion, we may be constituted by members who belong to the heterogeneous group on the bottom right. So through the big data, that would give us more opportunities to be more selective and also constitute different types of groups. So this Grow 360, we are actually introducing these into many Japanese corporates and really expanding the big data system in Japan. So a couple of points I'd like to mention. The human's decision-making process, it has been influenced by various preconceptions and ambiguity. So by the use of data, we can visualize the bias. And we believe this is very important. That is the first point. And the second point, if the person who are rulers, if they are to make all the decisions, for instance, if you're the president CEO, can you make all the decisions? That is another question that begs an answer. So perhaps by using the data, you can absorb and you can extract the most important information, important opinions. So I believe this is another concept food for thought in the AI big data era. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Fukuhara. I didn't quite ask for you, but you actually stood up and be very proactive, forthcoming. And in fact, actually, we had our privacy information on the presentation. So maybe Professor Yamamoto. So at the Cabinet Office Committee, we have worked together. So perhaps Professor Yamamoto could explore more and give us more of a provocative thought. So you could be seated or you could be standing up. But if it seems, perhaps because my previous presenter had stood up, maybe I should choose to stand up as well. So thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Yamamoto. I come from Keio University Law School. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the relationship between big data and privacy, and also the discrimination and diversity, and finally, the big data and democracy. Those are the 3 points I'd like to juxtapose. So in terms of the big data era, privacy is no longer just a security issue. It's not just security issue. So in Japan, quite often the focus is more on the information leakage, how it should be prevented, and so forth. But profiling has become the major focus. So recruit navigation, and also because of these incidents, the taste and the preference of the individuals could be forecasted, and the technology has been advanced in this field. So in this profiling, it may not be impossible to have complete anonymity. So, for instance, students may have this tweeting in the background. So by the use of profiling, we can identify that person, although they may try to hide it. Also, because of scoring and facial recognition and sensing. So, for instance, some of the surveillance camera in Russia, they check the movement of the vein, and they can actually assess whether they have a provocative, aggressive characteristic or not. So, through profiling, you can even read what the person is thinking inside their heart. So, so we are moving into an ultra surveillance society. So, on the surface, you may act as if you obey to the general society and the system. Perhaps inside you're thinking otherwise, and that can be detected through the sensing technology. So the question is whether the Japanese regulation is able to cope with this. I believe not. And the Japanese data protection is overly excessive in some part and very limited in some front. So they're protecting information that doesn't need to be protected, whereas information that needs to be protected is not. So it's quite distorted in terms of the Japanese data protection. So both for the business and the consumers, this is not a happy state.
So one thing I thought of is that data protection may have been just considered to be a formality. So for what purpose data protection was done, that was neglected. GDPR was mentioned, but in my personal view, I don't think we should just mimic what GDPR says, but there's a very important essence included. First of all, the private information protection is regarded as fundamental right, which is very important. And the background for this is Nazi German used the data to discriminate against Jews, and they were sent into Holocaust. So the right to self-determination of information is protected. So you talk about the ownership of the information, but that is not the way that they look at this. It's not exclusive data, but it is just considered to be fundamental human rights, and this is something that we should mimic. So this is the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, or EU Constitution, so to speak, and Article 8 is about protection of personal data, and this is considered to be fundamental rights. And in the preface, data protection is one of the basic rights, fundamental rights, and EU Constitution is now quoted in the GDPR. And so if you consider this as a human basic rights, then this could hinder innovation and business, but I would say no. So for what purpose the data protection is done? The overprotection and underprotection, that issue could be resolved. So considering for what purpose data protection is done, that is really important. For example, the individual world and the collective world, you should distinguish between these two. The private information world and also anonymized information world or asset world. So you have to apply different rules to those two. So Japanese people tend to think that everything is in the individual world and private information should be protected. And also big data is in the other world. But you have to distinguish between these two, looking at each piece of data. And also self-determination and consent are two different things. So European people think that self-determination is important, but consent supremacy is totally different. In one company, you provide all the living expense subsidy. So all the lifestyle should be videotaped. That's what they said. But as long as consent is there, you can do that. That is what is being said. But in the slave prohibition, even if there is a consent, you cannot do that, because if it undermines the dignity of the people, that is not something that you should do. So self-determination and consent should be two different things, and you have to make distinction. Now, with regard to diversity, as you know, in China, the Sesame credit or the scoring, credit scoring is now becoming very popular, and there are positive aspects of this. First of all, financial inclusion is one positive aspect, because you don't have the credit data and you are not able to participate in banking system, and now that you can borrow money from the bank, and also you can get free from the human being's bias, and also credit score can replace the word of mouth communication. So on the platform, you'll be treated fairly. And also, if you do unethical act, and then this could reduce your score. So you will refrain from the dangerous act, and there will be a peaceful, a safe society. But there are negative aspects. The first one is the black box issue. Why AI has come up with that particular score? The logic is really invisible if you do deep learning, especially. And this could lead to virtual slump. If you are given a low score, you don't know why. And so improving the score could become very difficult. And you could just stay in that lower score range, and you can't get away from that. And also the second issue is the inappropriate data inclusion and difficulty in verification. So we were doing that survey together with the students, but in Growth 360, you would never know that this was done. So there's no way of verifying that the result is correct. So if there is inappropriate data that could be mixed, you cannot really verify that that was not the case. And also, the behavior may be restricted. If you don't know which type of data is used, then you, for example, in Hong Kong, if you participate in demonstration, if your score could be undermined, then if you're worried about that, you may hesitate to participate in the demonstration. So, and also this reproduction issue, data set could be biased, or because of algorithmic bias, the past discrimination could be re-emphasized. And the higher views survey has given to the unfairness issue, because AI is trained with a limited amount of data or scope of data. The white people may be privileged, and if you are not white people, or if you have disabilities, then you may be given lower scores. So I don't have much time left, but those are the issues that I wanted to point out. But I'm not really the negative on the big data, just to be fair. So you have to be cautious. That's what I'm saying. So how to achieve the inclusive scoring, and to what extent you should use the score. That is what you need to consider. And using AI, how you can achieve the more inclusive and fair society with the big data, and you can achieve more inclusive and also fair society. I wanted to also touch upon the relationship with democracy. People in their 20s may be more ironic and sarcastic about democracy, but news and TV are more reliable, according to Genron Pio, and information on the internet is less unreliable. So there are many more people who say that you don't have to have democracy necessarily. So with the data profiling, the news that you get may have been already filtered. So there's an issue of filter bubble. So this is not unrelated. And also, Japan and OECD, we say the human-centered for AI. That's what OECD says as well.
In China, their take is harmony and education. So I believe is harmony and cooperation is what China has in mind. But I think we need to be aggressive in trying to realize this human-centered society using AI. Thank you very much. So, did you enjoy that presentation? So when you think about it, So we have the special lecturer and also the law school professor, and also we have the professor Emeritus from Keio University. Maybe it's a tad skewed, distorted. But rather than going in there, I'd like to introduce another person. So Ms. Kumi Fujisawa, co-founder of think tank SophiaBank. So as the young global leader of Davos Forum, she has been very active. And did you hear what she said? She says, I'm no longer young. She didn't have to comment that. But in any case, so she has a wealth of experience in brainstorming. So perhaps she can share with us what is expected of us in conducting the brainstorming. So going forward, the session belongs to you. You will be the protagonist. So we have 3 rooms. We have breakout session A. This is venue A. The topic is how far will big data go? So the 3 persons will be the leaders. So you will divide into 3. Next breakout session 2. This is at venue C. The topic is how will big data change democracy and capitalism? I think there was a previous survey that perhaps the young people do not truly believe in capitalism. But in any case, these are the 3 leaders. And finally, for the breakout session 3, the venue is B. The topic is how we live as an individual in a big data world. So we will discuss with these 3 resource people. And moving on, in terms of the timeline, for the initial 35 minutes, you will be engaging in the discussion. So together with the resource persons, 3 of them, you will divide into 3 groups and conduct a discussion. After the 35-minute discussion, the resource person would lead you in the panel discussion with the facilitator in the second half. So unless you engage in discussion, the breakout session will not be realized. So these are the 3 ideas that you have to keep in mind for brainstorming. So first of all, don't ask questions. So of course you have many questions, but please please try to deliver your own opinions. Second point, don't critique other people's opinions. Of course you can make proposal, but do not critique. And finally, do not take the microphone to yourself. So try to make your statement as short as possible. And so because the shorter you make your remarks, more innovation and more interaction we'd have. So we are almost starting it. So within 10 minutes, the breakout session would begin. So with whom you would like to discuss? With which resource person? It is first come, first served basis. So please go to the rooms that I have mentioned within 10 minutes. And when all the discussions are over, please come back to this session. Thank you very much. That is all. So in January at the Davos Forum, Prime Minister Abe has participated first time in 5 years, and he's talked about this data free flow with trust. So data needs to be free flow, but with trust. And this has been highly acclaimed by the heads of states. So this is very difficult and complicated, but this is what we'd like to discuss with all of you. So are we ready? So please head to the right venue. Thank you very much, and we'll see you later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for waiting. We'd like to start Brainstorm IR4 feedback session. The moderator will be served by Ms. Kumi Fujisawa. Now the floor is yours, Fujisawa-san. Thank you very much. I'm afraid of this applaud. I'm sure you have enjoyed the session, and I think there was an active discussion. Of course, everybody is interested in what was going on in other breakout sessions, so we'd like to ask each of the facilitators to share with us what they have discussed, and then we would like to have a discussion with everybody involved. So now, Hamada-san, would you like to start? Because our eyes met. Well, so in our breakout session, we have picked up a very big theme. How will big data change democracy and capitalism? So tended to become negative discussion. So we are now post-capitalism society and data democracy society. So how we can modify the current democracy, that's what we have discussed. And there are several keywords. The data has to be liberated from the game of ownership by individuals and firms. So data should be a shared asset. So the GAFA, limited platformers, are actually dominating the profits out of the data. But if the data is shared by everybody, then things will change. And shared value has been mentioned. Google and other GAFA type firms has been spreading this concept. It's not just for profit, but based on the shared value concept, you have to put that as a core of the business. Otherwise, you'd lose the support from the consumers. And so for the social good or medical purpose, there are some focuses being made by the platformers. So we have discussed that. But if you just sit back and do nothing, then the data ownership will make progress. So at the different stages of data, who will manage and who will decide the rules, and who will decide the liberation. So in China, where still the maturity is not enough, and the developed countries, the way you set the rules for this liberating the data would change. And are we able to now do this in Japan? Of course, we are still in the process of putting that together. But on the other hand, as in developed countries, there are so many issues that are piling up. How to use the data? You should set the rules for using the data. And if Japan can lead that efforts, then Japan can become a role model to the rest of the world. So that's where we stopped. So if Japan can do that, that is what we would like to discuss. Well, Takeshita-san, well, if you are talking about big data, since it is called big, the discussion tends to become big. Well, it was not the pun that I intended, so it was unintended. So how the individuals would live, so how the government should do and industry should do, that's also important. But individuals, what we should do. So there are three pillars. If your boss becomes an AI, what would you do? So if the AI becomes your boss, so as was discussed in Professor Takenaka's session, if AI makes decisions, then the existing discrimination and social structure would be maintained. The Hama-chan from Tsuribaka Nishi, the comic, the people who are ambiguous in a positive manner should be tolerated. So whether we should combine AI and humans, or the AI should be trained. Well, Nishida-san also discussed, in order to not to be manipulated in elections, what should we do? So information manipulation and the ordinary democratic country, the convincing work. So the politicians that are doing what they do for the sake of the people. So what's the difference? Well, you just put yourself into the mountains, because whatever you do, you'll be manipulated by information. So you just isolate yourself in the mountains, or you accommodate whatever information that comes in large amount, and also making sense to you. That is really a keyword as well. And also, Naoya Fujita said that everything is being recommended. What is the liberty and freedom? Well, I'm sure everybody uses Amazon. There's going to be a Black Friday, and is it really being free? Well, but advertising agency representatives said that this is what they have always done. Are they just recommending just for competition, or are they supporting consumers? And of course, jumping was one of the keywords. Recommendation engines with the current capabilities, you can predict what they're going to say. So there was a jump in the algorithm or jump the logic as a human nature. Being it Hama-chan or Tora-san, AI is inevitable, but how you can actually tame them is a question. Now, Takeshita-san, Sasaki-san, well, we talked about business or humans data and distribution. So there are three keywords that stayed in my mind. The first one is privacy nihilism. Of course, data will be taken away. So you may give up your privacy protection. That is the nihilism, and that is spreading in the U.S. And Shoko-san talked about paternalism, especially in the genetic information. Even if you give that information to individuals, they cannot make sense of that. So maybe paternalism is something that you should pursue. And also local Chinese, whether we should go for Chinese type or should go for distributed type, or if you go to Fukuoka, for example, and give environment where you can take advantage of information like you do in China. There was such a recommendation or opinion viewed by one of the audience members. And in the nihilism, the logic of the data, if you know that and then you become the nihilistic, or if you don't know and if you become nihilistic, that will be totally different. So you have to do the education. So there are several common threads that I may have seen. So Tsuda-san, you've been listening to what they have to say, and you've been moderating, but you are now extremely busy this year. So you are just not a facilitator, but here. So I have been interested in listening to the presentations, but especially the participants. Facilitators are talking about the possibility and future vision. With that in mind, they were discussing, but the participants in the floor expressed their concerns, and then the concerns were addressed, and that was the starting point for the discussions. And I've been traveling from breakout session to breakout session. So there were some confrontations, several axes, and they were going back and forth. So they were worried, but there's convenience as well. So which one should we embrace? And also, is it logic or emotions, or ultimately data-controlled society is safe, but you are being supervised and controlled, and you may lose freedom. That was also a confrontation. So as I have been listening to the discussions, as we consider life, do you prefer a stable life or life with excitement? So that may be a different way of looking at it. So a partial optimization and the total optimization in the sense of business. So AI and big data is used in society in that you may be talking about total optimization, but actually what you're talking about really is a partial optimization, and different people with different capacity will say things different. And this is not the kind of question that you can answer through only brainstorming. And in my personal view, in whatever breakout session, fairness and equality were talked about, but they were talking about the cutting-edge technologies. But as we go along, is it really possible in Japan? Once you get to that point, then you just stop. In order to be really fair and equitable. Of course, blockchain will be convenient if it is introduced, but What will become most convenient with blockchain is the administrative services, but the my number, the social security number, is still in chaos, and the official document, even the official document may not be managed properly in Japan, so there could be some disparity and gap between and us. And what was interesting is that as you explore more in here, the data paternalism that Takahashi-san was talking about is something that we are getting closer to. So data communism is something that we may get to converge to. That was also a common topic. And then in which, in any breakout session, they just concluded that was not the goal. And breakout session B and C both talked about how they should ensure that they can enjoy their life without being restricted. So how to live an enjoyable life or well-being, that may have been the point.
So thank you very much. So we have perhaps people who are participated as resource persons. Are there anything to add on? Of course, we have a nice summary from the facilitator, but our time is tight. If you don't have anything to add on, we'll just move on. If not, so Professor Takenaka, now I'd like to give you the microphone. So listening to the presentation, I think there's definitely a common thread. So keyword, it seems as if the centralized system is good, but whether is it convincing, whether it makes sense or not, I think everyone is into the Yamamoto-ism. That was kind of my take. So Professor, what would you say about this? So let's move on to the discussion. Thank you very much for posing that very difficult question. So in the wrap-up session, it's always the toughest session after brainstorming, because whatever we say, we always get into trap. So it is really difficult to finalize. So I'd like to take a completely different perspective in conducting this wrap-up session. And of course, there has a number of keywords have been raised. So Hamada-san, we've talked about shared value. So it's from Miyata-san. So shared value. So I was there listening into the discussion. So more concretely, what needs to be done? Let's talk to Miyata-san. Let's talk to Miyata-san, the resource person. So what needs to be done? So if you can give us the prescription. So the shared value. So we need to better the society around the axis of shared value. So, of course, I'm talking to the economist, so I'm somewhat ashamed to share with you my ideas. And we have always been voicing that there's something more better, there's something that is higher in value than money. But, of course, money is the way to exchange value. So after the Industrial Revolution, the question is how we can contribute to the system. And I believe the society was designed in such ways. But now we are at the data-driven society. So we are starting to see value aside from the monetary value. For instance, credit scoring. So of course, the way you control it, some say it is part of dystopia. But in any case, if you have higher credit, then you can have your kids into better school. So it could be an alternative to the monetary value. But also through this credit, you can exchange new types of value. Also, with this new concept of SDGs, of course, there's always been investment related to ESG. But as we try to contribute to shared value, we need to continuously operate our business. That is already happening. In fact, in France, in the textiles industry, if we're going to exploit the developing countries, they will regulate that industry. So in France, that is already happening. So Apple or Google or... So for these companies, as we use more and more data, Professor Yamamoto mentioned about the importance of right to access. So it is definitely becoming one of the fundamental rights for human beings. If that's the case, we need to be accountable to the people. So if that's the case, the contribution to shared value needs to be done by the corporations. Otherwise, we cannot continue with this economy using data. So why did I start the research from the medical? The reason is because shared value, it stands at the very forefront, ahead of the monetary value, because we need to save lives. So we need to visualize the value aside from the monetary value. And the question is whether we can run the society based on that. That is a major issue. So it is definitely becoming part of the cycle, economic cycle. So in terms of prescription, if you were to ask, so of course this is not it's not a comprehensive, it is not a single solution to everything, because we may have this virtual slums and so forth. So in the multifaceted society with multifaceted value, we need to develop a society. It is definitely a challenge. So I'd like to pose a question. So what do we need to do again? So in Japan, what is lacking now? So it could be the fundamental human rights, data portability. That could be the fundamental human rights. So the data portability, which is currently owned by the companies, corporates, there's no law that stipulates that individuals have the data portability. That is first point. And the second point, the data in relation to privacy. So it could be that we have restricted too much the self-control. So there has not been a free flow of the data, not enough flow. So data, it is a common asset. So if you have, if you add one data with 100,000, 200,000 data, the chances are you can have better medicine, better medical care. So we need to develop a new sort of law based on the idea that data is a common asset. And we need to be practical in operating this. So that is exactly where we are starting. And in fact, through the discussion, we would like to challenge towards that direction. Thank you very much. So this is indeed brainstorming. So actually, I shouldn't be posing questions. But in order to stimulate the conversation, I would like to pose many questions as much as possible. Thank you very much for your answer. So Takeshita-san. So in terms of whether it makes sense, whether it's convincing, you mentioned that it's really important. So you could give us an example. So for instance, whether it is convincing to have a cherry blossom bumi or not, it could be anything. So in order to have that convincing feeling, could you give us an example? And if you can pose an example for this particular event, or actually, could I give this question to Nishida-san? So in order to be convincing, we need to have the criteria. So it needs to be a criteria that is shared by the society. And we do not have that in Japan. So aside from rationale and also being an economy, there is no such criteria in existence. So in order to be convincing, we need to have that. So are you saying just in Japan or in the world? Actually, in the world, yes, there is definitely in existence. So for instance, in EU, there is. So they are putting higher value on fairness as opposed to rationality, and that is reflected in the basic fundamental rights. So, for instance, in the U.S., you can go back to the Constitution. So, but in Japan, that is not in existence. So, what needs to be done? So we need to change the political education. I don't know if this is possible, but that needs to be done. Realistically, in Japan, there's no opportunity to really touch upon the practical history of politics. So no one knows about how the LDP history was, what has been their opinions, and so forth. No one knows that in the Japanese society. So we could start to instigate this discussion.
野党がほとんど反対してですね。
So, but of course, perhaps because people aren't convinced. So in order to get there, in order for them to make sense, what should we do to make them start this change? So it really depends on who writes the history of LDP history. Is it going to be the liberals or is it going to be the conservatives? One way to address it is we can assign certain volume to one side and the other side to the other party. So based on that, we could have discussion at the school. So could we assign this equal amount to each party then? Yeah, that could be a plan. Yes, that could be a plan. So it sounds like an NHK program, but thank you very much for that input. Local Chinese, that was another topic raised. So it is somewhat similar to Super City that we are proposing. So Sasaki-san, what is the kind of local Chinese you have in mind? So in the positive sense, so there's a free flow of data, and there are many AI researchers. And Ishizumi-san mentioned this. So China, they have freedom of speech. So a lot of people immigrate to US or even Canada. So because data is so well managed that within the course of 7 minutes, people could be arrested. So many people in China are living in places where there's no freedom. So I think there is attractiveness in building a society where there is economy and also there's freedom. So Fukuoka is known to be a startup city, so that is why it is quite attractive. So Ishizuma-san, I'd like to talk to you about that as well. So smart city, local Chinese. So I think these are very much important and necessary in Japan. Though this is not China, this is not US, there needs to be strengths that Japan has, and Japan needs to have as well. So local is definitely a keyword. So within the local society, where the privacy is protected, still the data is openly transacted. And so unless you come there, you cannot actually do interesting experiment. So people may actually choose to stay in those regional cities for a set period of time, let's just say 1 month or so. So by doing that, it may be difficult to centralize all the data in one place, but perhaps in one particular or several different regional cities, we could have very interesting experiments such as automated driving or AI by having those environment developed there. So that's what I meant by local Chinese. So Super City, it actually went to the cabinet deliberation, but it hadn't passed the diet. So our level of consciousness, as opposed to the political leaders, unfortunately, there's still a huge gap. So the question is, how should we progress from here? So I was actually in the background listening to this discussion. So about this being convincing, about this making sense. So the people in China, they are somewhat convinced, or they convinced with the current state. But if you have experienced freedom, of course, they may not be fully. So this level of convincingness, or it's different vis-a-vis the level of culture and also experience. So it's not quite local Chinese in Japan. I think it may be very Japanese.
多分重要なポイント。
So how we should do that, it would become a key. Now I'd like to ask Tsuda-san. So this was a super talked about topic. It was really wonderful. There are a lot of exhibition items, but what stimulated me most is the cigarette butt was left, and you threw it away, but you're actually throwing away the DNA data. Even if you're talking about private information protection, you just casually throw it away, and you just reproduce the face and also the spray to eliminate DNA. That was also placed there. So that was surprising. So private information, to what extent we are serious really about protecting our information. There are several different sets of criteria classified. So based on those criteria, there was some conflict axis. So what is the demarcation that we should think about, and what sort of prescription that you have? Well, what I failed to say earlier is that as I listened to the presentations, well, not explicit in words, but they were talking about classes, the social classes. I think they are more obvious in Western countries, but because of cultural foundation, you cannot jump those social classes, but that is much easier in Japan. Even if you are not privileged in your family, if you work hard enough to get admitted to Tokyo University, then you could jump the social classes. But once you become a credit score controlled society, because of credit score society, there might be fairness introduced, but the Japanese way of casually jumping the social classes may become impossible. So, and also the other thing is that, in the discussions, I think people have sort of noticed, but not expressed in words, the irreversibility. So safe and comfortable data-oriented society is something that we're looking for. But how you can ensure the private information, they may be contradictory to each other, but actually we cannot stop the flow and trend to go to the data-oriented society. And if there is such irreversibility, how you can ensure your protection? So what should we do in this irreversible situation? So the shared value is one of the ideas, but what I thought was that for the past 10 years, this has been formed in different ways, ESG or fair trade, or SDGs, or spend shift, or Satoyama capitalism in the Japanese specific way. So the first 10 years, this has been talked about, but now for the past 4 or 5 years, there has been real services that has been manifested in the actual real economy. And in the Western countries, you take advantage of GAFA, and they are trying to go into that direction. And actual services are actually implemented in society, but there are some values that may not be commercialized that way. Japan is not that good in commercializing these services, and there might be a widened gap between Japan and Western countries because we don't have the experience of making rules by ourselves. That may be the reason. So what are the solutions? What can we do in this political context? If it is difficult, then changing education will take time, but the diversity in the companies, you can have side jobs, like the laws and regulations can actually encourage them. That might be the way that Japan can change. Well, this was something that makes sense to me. So we're running out of time. So I would like to give you a very challenging question to each one of you, and to answer that question for 2 minutes. For example, you use big data. There are positive benefits, but platformers, GAFA, Alibaba, Tencent, there are those platformers, but there's no such entities in Japan. Why not? If there had been such platformer, we could have had a sense of urgency much earlier. So there needs to be regulation on GAFA, but everybody would really wish that there could be some player like that in Japan as well. So how you can sort of develop those platformers, for the lack of better words. And also you have to make rules, but what sort of rules have to be made first and foremost? And digital documents, competition council, I'm an observer to that, and Matsuo-san is also a member of that. And Chief Cabinet Secretary is presiding this meeting. So if you are an assistant to the Chief Cabinet Secretary, what sort of advice would you give? So how you can create players like GAFA or platformers in Japan, and what sort of rules to be made with that player present in Japan, and what sort of things that we should do. So Honda-san, would you like to start? A very difficult questions. At Ishizumi-san's session, Line and Yahoo merger, what sort of business opportunity would this provide? Well, we don't have platformers in Japan because we like US. We don't hate Amazon or Google or Facebook. So do you need any other platformer specific to Japan? I don't think so. Rakuten may be Fury. Nobody would actually would like to have some Japanese specific platformers. So Line, Yahoo may not be so supported. So once the data is distributed between different players, then that should be okay. We may not have to develop a Japanese original platformer necessary. As for rulemaking, well, not the paternalism, but self-determination by the individuals should be implemented. So Ota-san said that the Chinese type society may be fit for Japan. Well, we Japanese people may have that nature, and there's a high level of trust in something public, but maybe individual self-determination, it should be something that we should go for to make society better in Japan. So rather than just casually going for a Chinese direction, we should be aware of this and then get self-determined. And rulemaking should facilitate that. Hamada-san. Well, Japanese specific platformer is not necessary. I also agree with that idea. So what we discuss is AI and big data benefit is a diverse values, and diverse added values can be provided. Well, big data may sound like it is unifying everything, but actually you can identify diverse values and they can be matched. And this could be a strength for Japanese people. Well, what sort of businesses are there to take advantage of the strengths of the business? The contents business, like manga, a comic, and games. And Obara-san is saying this. When I buy cosmetics, I don't use Amazon. I use @cosme, and I also use a portal site for restaurants. So we don't need Amazon-like platformers. The platformers that are quite strong in a very specific area. With higher values. That is the strength of Japanese players. So Line, Yahoo type of platformers may lose out in the world because there is something similar in other countries. But I interviewed executives of Yahoo, and they say that they may have hard time making business presence in overseas. So what about rulemaking? Well, sense making is also important. How convincing is it? Well, if this data is used for your own happiness, then you'll be sold. And so that data is being increased, and what is becoming a problem is the healthcare cost being huge, and there's a shortage of care providers, caregivers. And if we can solve those problems with big data, then people will be convinced. In order to reduce healthcare costs, the medical information is being shared in the public arena in the Netherlands. And my number, the social security number, is not registered because they don't know how it is being used. You may be having the tax officers visiting you all of a sudden, but that is not the case. And if this is the purpose that the my number or data is used for, then you will be more comfortable in sharing your information. So you have to have accountability for what purpose a specific data is used. Then you can get consensus from the general public. Taketa-san. Well, in terms of Line, Yahoo players, rather than Line, Yahoo, Korean neighbors and SoftBank. Korean neighbor chairman has hardly accepted interviews, but in several times that he has, the diversity of network is something that was mentioned. The neighbor and the newspaper company, the relationship is very similar to the relationship between Yahoo and newspaper. It is very Asia-specific, but they have unique idea, and that is very important. Of course, GAFA is wonderful, and Yahoo Line will not win in the world. But if there is a company with a certain scale, and you can also talk to them in Japanese. That is very important.
日本人が息も
The reason is if the Japanese were to raise objection, and we need to have someone respond to it. So Facebook and Twitter. So there has been a fairly strong objection or criticism vis-a-vis Facebook and others. But if there is a Japanese company or if there's a headquarters in Japan that can respond to Japanese, that is quite powerful. So I think it is an important factor. It is a huge transition point. So as the citizen society is concerned, will be a huge step. So another point is about the rule making. So I'd like to take this opportunity to point out about that class society. So Professor Yamamoto mentioned in his presentation. So in the West, so we can actually feel this social will. What exactly is freedom? What exactly is dignity? You have a really good perception of that will. However, whether everyone is convinced, that is highly questionable. So the elite or the opinion leaders or the leaders of the corporates may share this idea. So for instance, social care or the spirit of constitution and so forth. But if you were to apply this to Japan, quite often, Japan and actually we grew up together, and so we need to explain to everyone. So this may be taken as, this may be misunderstood if I were to state this, but I think it is important to have consensus amongst the leaders. So it is a really difficult point to raise because it may lead to elitism and so forth. But I think it's important to explain to everyone and have the consensus amongst the leaders. And so it is a complicated issue as GAFA and China are developing. And so we cannot actually slow down. We need to have the will, we need to have that will to really push this through. So where we lag behind is Nagatacho and the mobile phones. Probably that's where we're lacking in terms of the leadership. So Sasaki-san mentioned about the self-determination within the breakout session. So prior to self-determination, though, so within this highly developed data, it seems as if we've been allowed to live rather than living in the data society. So having this feeling of really living in the society, to be really self-affirmative, that is really important. Quite often, according to the international survey, the Japanese self-respect is extremely low. So I think we need to change this before approaching this issue of GAFA and so forth. So what needs to be done then? So there's no common understanding of privacy amongst the Japanese people. We've never thought about it, and of course, and there was no governance system. So if you were to talk to a cabinet secretary, we need to have a government agency or a ministry that is in charge of privacy. So you may have the commissioner. You can assign them from the private sector, and the privacy lessons will be provided even at the elementary school level. So at the individual level, we need to enlighten the people from young age that privacy is indeed important, and we need to observe it. So whether we can have a GAFA-like entity from Japan, given the current regulatory framework and competitive climate, it is very difficult. So in Japan, and it was in GAFA, so having the local culture in Japan. So Instagram is one example that we had. So in the initial phase, I had conducted an interview to Kevin, who's the founder of Instagram. So the way it has been used, it differs by country. So Japanese people use it in a fairly abnormal way. So how come Japanese people love cats so much? Because there are so many likes for cats uploads of photos. And whereas in the U.S. also, quite often you would actually take a photo of food from top down to the food, but that does not happen in the U.S. So what people post on Instagram is quite often home parties and so forth. So some of the mystery of the Japanese Instagrammers is because people tend to post a lot on cats and also food. But after 3 to 4 years, now it's changed. Now even the Americans are doing that. Now they have a food Instagram. So we are seeing more of this inherently Japanese culture blending into the global and American Instagram culture. So it is quite an interesting, a rare example. So let's just say the abnormal, or let's just say creative sense of Japanese, the specialized platform may be able to saturate, may be able to disseminate into the global society. So the specialized platform that has been derived from Japan, from East Asia to the rest of the world. So I think there is a huge opportunity here. So we need to develop rules, but at the same time, we shouldn't eliminate those initial buds because there are opportunities for them. So we have been going around different sessions, breakout sessions, Fujisawa-san. So we only have a very limited discussion, but at the individual breakout sessions, there were a lot of essential discussion. I was very much impressed. So Fujisawa-san, well, it is your take. So I have been participating in this every year, and now the level of participation has really been enhanced this year. Also, another point I've mentioned, so there was a statement on local Chinese, but I think to be more convincing, to be more persuasive, there needs to be philosophy, there needs to be more concept generated from each person. So it is not just Japan as a whole. Well, it could be a local Fukuoka-ism or local Takenaka-ism. So more on the local basis, we need to have options that is used, where the data is used on a local basis. And that would bring about more pluralistic values. So I was wondering if any of the breakout sessions were discussing on that. Also, another point, we'd like to have that data portability rule established as early as possible. So also we need to be clear what purpose are we doing this. And one of the reasons why we don't have the platformers in Japan is perhaps because these platformers do not have a philosophy in Japan. So some of the venture companies in Japan, now they're starting to really claim their own vision and their own values. So they are starting to have that discussion to instigate people to be aware of those values. So obviously we are seeing this trend happening in the private sector. So really the government needs to move fast to develop such rules. So just as we talked about the cherry blossom viewing session. So of course there has been an issue in the government right now. And I'm pretty sure many of you are aware of the issues. And we talked about this today. So we need to develop more case studies where data is utilized. And what is important is to have that convincing feel. It needs to be persuasive. And also, so in this, the fourth industrial revolution, the software infrastructure is the identification of individuals. And the My Number system is not being fully utilized. So in India, we have 1.2 billion yen, have all the biometrics, all the private information has been registered in India. So they even have a specific government agency in charge of the privacy information. And the first commissioner for this agency, so Mr. Nanda Nilekani, he's from Infosys, so he used to be the first commissioner of this agency. So I conducted an interview in the past, and I asked him, how were you able to realize that project? Of course, in India, once you register the fingerprint, that would become the privacy information, and you can open the bank accounts. So of course, that was definitely one of the prerequisites. But according to him, we really try to persuade the people how this would help you, how this would bring you more convenience, it would be a benefit to you. We just continue to explain to the people. He said that was the key point. So we need to have a leader who would really leave such concept in Japan. And in order to do so, we need to execute various actions. So again, this is brainstorming. We would not have a concrete conclusion. So apologies for being somewhat forceful in our discussion, but I would hope that you would continue to explore this issue. Thank you all for your participation today. Thank you. Would you give a round of applause to the panelists? This is Brainstorming for IR4.